everyone. We ask everyone to please settle down as we will be starting the program at 9 o'clock. Thank you. Mm. Yeah. Good morning to our speakers and distinguished guests from the government, civil society organizations, the academe, members of the diplomatic corps, and think tanks. I am Shanice Espiritu Amador. I am the Deputy Executive Director for Research of the Strat-based ADR Institute, and I will be your host and moderator for today. Welcome to this hybrid town hall discussion entitled Unveiling Asymmetric Challenges Through Assertive Transparency. This event is organized by the Strat-based Institute in partnership with the Embassy of Australia in the Philippines. This is a hybrid event. Thank you very much to everyone who is with us here in this event venue, and thank you as well to everyone who is joining us via Zoom and those watching us from Facebook Live. Technological advancements lead to a deeply interconnected geopolitical and even digital landscape. As traditional security risks persist, new security challenges, such as disinformation and cybersecurity, will also emerge. Issues in the digital world include concerns about disinformation tactics, psychological operations, and cyber warfare. In relation to maritime security, the Philippines has evolved its strategy to assertive transparency that includes keeping the public and the international community informed about the developments in the West Philippine Sea. As such, unveiling and understanding asymmetric security challenges through assertive transparency measures becomes paramount in shaping diplomatic, defense, and economic initiatives. This event gathers key experts to discuss their latest publications on disinformation and maritime security in the Philippines. Intending to shed light on asymmetric challenges, these research projects that will be presented and discussed today demonstrate the interplay between maritime security and assertive transparency. As we begin our event, it is important to discuss the role of civil maritime cooperation, especially in promoting Philippine national interests. To formally open our event, let us all welcome Professor Victor Andres Dindomanhit, President of the Strat-based ADR Institute, as he delivers his opening remarks. Please give him a round of applause.
Thank you so much, Shanice. Good morning to everyone. For friends of the Institute, uh, from local institutions, local partners, supporters from the diplomatic community, friends from media. We're here as part of our commitment in Stratbase to promote our national interests through civil maritime cooperation. Throughout the years, the Philippines and the international community have confronted various challenges in their geopolitical landscape, encompassing traditional, non-traditional, and even emerging security issues. Among the geopolitical risks and opportunities we have identified at Stratbase Institute is the digital divide and the impact of emerging and transformational technologies. If some of you would remember, we had a cyber conference just last January. As the world embraces the advantages of the digital era, its inherent interconnectedness introduces new challenges related to cybersecurity. Misinformation and disinformation is critical. As the Philippines faces asymmetric security challenges in the maritime security within the West Philippine Sea, the scope of its national security concerns expands to threats brought by disinformation and misinformation campaigns and narrative warfare. This can be seen in China's portrayal of Manila's activities within the Philippine territory as unprofessional and dangerous that seriously infringe on China's sovereignty. When they say that, and I remember this territory, that some of which are part of municipalities 3 hours away by car from where we are, how can it be Chinese territory? It also characterizes Philippine actions as acts of infringement and provocation. These blatant misinformation tactics and overt tirades against peaceful and legal acts not only undermine the stability of the Republic of the Philippines, this also disrupt the peace and stability of the broader Indo-Pacific region. Our neighbors' persistent claims over the West Philippine Sea remain inconsequential in altering the 2016 ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Their aggressive actions will not grant them the support, we believe, of the international community. Their swarming and blocking tactics, excessive island building, destruction of the marine environment that we raised as early as 2016, and water cannon tactics cannot overturn the established and well-respected international law in a rules-based international order. As the Philippines stakes its claim on the West Philippine Sea, it adopts a strategy of assertive transparency. The conduct of research and data-driven studies on the Philippine maritime security landscape reinforces Philippine sovereignty and the territorial integrity in its maritime territory. Through assertive transparency, the Philippines affirms its rightful place within its own territory and continuously positions itself on the right side of history. By expanding public awareness in the West Philippine Sea and building support from the international community, the Philippines proudly upholds the defense of a rules-based international order. In realizing this role, the Philippines recognizes that cooperation with like-minded states is critical as it navigates geopolitical and geoeconomic risks and opportunities. In a survey commissioned by our institute, our partners with Pulse Asia, Filipinos emphasize that the Marcos Jr. administration should work with trusted allies and partners. We have seen the number consistently to foster economic growth while upholding the 2016 arbitral victory. People have asked me always, why do we keep on pushing this issue, especially during, I used to say, the dark days, 6 years of dark days from 2016 to 2022. I've always said we need to stand up for national interests. And if we need to bring this to the public sphere when government keeps quiet, we will bring it. And that's the commitment of our institute. And I'm now happy that we are now working with government. We're working with the whole of Philippine society. And it's reflected. When 90% of Filipinos would like us to assert our rights. When 90% would like us to modernize our external defense capabilities, improve our Coast Guard. You knew that those 6 years from 2016 to 2022 did not go to waste. And guided still by national interest, the concept of national interest, the pursuit of a strategy of assertive transparency needs to be carried out to what I said earlier, a whole of Philippine society approach. We are here from the private sector, from civil society. Our media friends has always been our partners in this approach. And united by the common goal of preserving the peace in Philippine waters, civil maritime efforts require collaboration among various sectors, including government, private sector, civil society organizations, and the diplomatic community. To demonstrate its resolve to defend the West Philippine Sea against asymmetric challenges and disinformation tactics, the Philippines must embrace its middle power status, leveraging on assertive transparency, promoting civil maritime security cooperation while leveraging the support of the international community. Again, good morning to all. Thank you for joining us. For those who are here, thank you for those who are joining us by Zoom. I think 100, 150 people have confirmed. So hopefully we can have a morning of good discussion and continue to move this issue forward collectively. Good morning.
Thank you, Professor Dindo Manhit, for your opening remarks. Our first speaker will discuss the Philippine Coast Guard's role in the practice of assertive transparency. Please welcome on stage the advisor of the Commandant for Maritime Security of the Philippine Coast Guard, Commodore J. Tariela.
morning, everyone. Before I start, I would like to clarify I'm no longer the advisor of the Commandant for the West Philippine Sea. I'm just a special staff now of our incumbent Commandant. I believe he's competent enough so that he needs no advising from me. Your Excellencies, members of the diplomatic community, to Professor Victor Andres Manhit, the President of Strat-based Albert de Rosario Institute, fellow speakers, my co-workers in the government, media friends, all those present both physically and virtually, isang magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. I would like to express my gratitude to Strat-based for extending an invitation for me to speak before you today. I would also like to commend Sir Dindo Manhit for, again, successfully organizing this forum on unveiling asymmetric challenges to assertive transparency. Nearly a year ago, I had the privilege of participating in a panel discussion entitled Countering Gray Zone Operations in the Maritime Indo-Pacific, which was also organized by Strat-based. This forum marked the first time I spoke about the role of the Philippine Coast Guard in addressing gray zone operations in the West Philippine Sea. During that time, our focus was primarily on China's gray zone activities and how we could respond to them. It was only during this discussion that I first emphasized the importance of transparency in shedding light on China's actions in the gray zone. During those early stages of our transparency strategy, there were individuals who questioned the significance of exposing Chinese illegal activities, aggressive behavior, and bullying tactics in the West Philippine Sea. Some argued that these efforts were driven solely by the desire for additional funding for the Philippine Coast Guard or even to advance our own modernization agenda without actually considering the government's broader strategy in the West Philippine Sea. There were also those who believed that transparency would only serve to provoke China and escalate tension in the West Philippine Sea. There were also individuals who dismissed the need for exposure, claiming that incidents of harassment against Filipino fishermen and bullying of Philippine Coast Guard and Philippine Navy vessels in the West Philippine Sea were rare or no longer occurring. These individuals shared a similar perspective with those who support China and advocate for the Philippines to endure Chinese bullying without raising objections or attracting attention from the international community. However, it is worth mentioning that the birth pains of the Transparency Initiative is never that easy to endure. Try to imagine how would the agencies of the national government would react to changing the usual practice of almost a decade of not publicizing anything in the West Philippine Sea. It is truly difficult and burdensome to justify to other government agencies why we would fly our aircraft over the West Philippine Sea, embedding media personalities. It has always been a struggle then on how we justify the objective of why are we going to do a press conference and give away to the media outlets those compelling images and videos that would expose China's bullying behavior in the West Philippine Sea. I also remember that in those early days of our transparency, that we must put so much time and effort to temper down the press releases that it would not sound provocative for China. Reflecting on the journey, I feel a sense of pride and fulfillment, knowing that the shift towards publicizing Chinese bullying actions in the West Philippine Sea has been not only sustained, but also gained support from all government agencies now. This remarkable success can be attributed to the unwavering commitment of our National Security Advisor, General Eduardo Año. As the chairman of the National Task Force West Philippine Sea, he has played a crucial role in adopting, supporting, and sustaining our transparency strategy. His support has been instrumental in ensuring that the idea of exposing Chinese actions would not fade away after its conception. Without his leadership, our transparency initiative would not have seen the light of day. His belief in the importance of shedding light on China's bullying behavior in the West Philippine Sea has become the driving force behind our collective efforts in the National Task Force. We owe a great deal of gratitude for General Año for his invaluable support and the success that we have achieved so far. Since then, we have successfully transformed the way the Philippines addresses the reporting of incidents in the West Philippine Sea. We have shifted from silently enduring bullying tactics to adopting a more assertive approach in narrating and exposing illegal actions of China. Initially, it was only the Philippine Coast Guard primarily that faced the media, and it was very difficult then for other government agencies to fully comprehend and accept the rationale behind publicly reporting these incidents. However, as our transparency initiative gained recognition and momentum, we have reached a significant milestone in our efforts. We now hold joint press conferences side by side together with the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and even the National Security Council. This collaborative approach to addressing these incidents in the West Philippine Sea is unprecedented and marks a significant shift in our collective response. The Filipino people now were given the opportunity to listen to the factual narratives directly from the national government, ensuring that the truth was not hidden or obscured. Secondly, our efforts to publicize compelling videos and images that truthfully document Chinese illegal actions in the West Philippine Sea have garnered international attention and condemnation. More countries now are expressing their criticism and standing in solidarity with Manila against Beijing's bullying behavior and blatant disregard for international law. This increased global awareness has led to a positive outcome for our defense cooperation efforts. More countries now are reaching out to the Philippines for defense cooperation, and there is growing support for the modernization of the armed forces of the Philippines and even the Philippine Coast Guard. This support not only strengthens our capabilities, but also underscores that the international community's recognition of the importance of upholding the international law and in maintaining the rules-based order. Third, the national government's disclosure of Chinese aggression in the West Philippine Sea has effectively raised public awareness among Filipinos. Over the 6 years of former President Duterte's administration, our country was divided in its perception of China. The limited information about the situation in the South China Sea during President Duterte allowed misinformation to proliferate on social media platforms. This led many to wrongly perceive China even as a good friend and a partner for peace and development. It is evident now that regardless of your social status and political leaning, Filipinos now unite in recognizing China's aggressive and unlawful actions in the West Philippine Sea. Based on the latest survey conducted by Okta Research, it revealed that 72% of Filipinos favor asserting territorial rights through expanded naval patrols and troop presence in the West Philippine Sea. Fourth, the other measuring stick of our success in the transparency is on how our legislators appreciate the patriotic duty and selfless service of the armed forces of the Philippines and the Philippine Coast Guard in patrolling our waters in the West Philippine Sea. With the passage of the national budget for this year, we can contend that the transparency strategy has affected tremendously their appreciation on supporting the modernization of the armed forces and acquisition of vessels for the Philippine Coast Guard. But beyond this fiscal support, it is worth mentioning that there are lawmakers who were previously silent in criticizing China's actions, but have now taken a stand and publicly condemned China. Some of them even have gone far as wearing t-shirts with markings West Philippine Sea during a basketball match against China in Manila. Our transparency initiative has not only had positive impacts, but has also served as a compelling evidence of our success in advancing our national interests. One clear indication of this is the noticeable increase in China's aggressive information operation here in Manila. Previously, Chinese disinformation was not as rampant or widespread across various social media platforms. However, with our efforts to expose their actions and bring transparency to the forefront, their approach has become more intense and aggressive. This shift in their tactics is a clear indication that our transparency is making an impact and challenging their fake narrative. The fact that China is resorting to more aggressive information operation demonstrates the recognition of the effectiveness of the transparency initiative. Through amplification of their efforts to counter our message, they are acknowledging the power of truth and the impact it has on public opinion. Based on my personal observation and personal experience, the Chinese have employed three approaches to counter our transparency initiative. First, the Chinese government denies or downplays the incidents we raise to our factual narrative. For example, they lied about the swarming of the Chinese maritime militia in Julian Felipe Reef and falsely claimed that they were just ordinary fishermen taking a shelter because of bad weather. The Chinese ambassador also even held a press conference to downplay the military-grade laser incident last year in response to our press statement that such action of China Coast Guard resulted to the temporary blindness of our crew. Secondly, they utilize social media platforms and rely on their trolls to spread fake news and disinformation to support their false narrative. In the cyber information space, they aim to sow discord, disunity, and confusion among the Filipino people. Currently, they are confusing the public by claiming that the president's approach in the West Philippine Sea is solely influenced by the United States. They suggest that if President Marcos does not change his stance, the Philippines may suffer as collateral damage amidst the great power competition. Their third approach involves utilizing all available resources to undermine the credibility of the messengers. As the success of our transparency initiative relies on the individuals delivering the message to both domestic and international audiences, we have become targets in an effort to discredit us and tarnish our image. Personally, I have been their favorite target of their attacks on social media platforms. These attacks are often personal and misleading, aiming to confuse the Filipino people into believing that my objectives do not align with the interests of our country, but rather are influenced by other countries, particularly the United States of America. As we approach the second year of transparency strategy, I want to reaffirm our unwavering commitment to this initiative. However, it is critical for the national government to strategize and ensure that our objective remains focused on responding to Chinese bullying behavior in the West Philippine Sea. Additionally, it is also important for the Filipino people to safeguard the transparency efforts, ensuring that they solely target the illegal actions of People's Republic of China and nothing more. As a nation, we must ensure that our endeavors to expose Chinese illegal actions are not exploited as a mere political slogan to ride with the popularity of the West Philippine Sea and play with the Filipinos' sense of patriotism. A journalist friend told me once that the fight for sovereignty and politics make strange bedfellows. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that our transparency is neither assertive nor measured. Our transparency initiative is strategic because it does not require us to be assertive in telling the truth or to withhold a portion of truth in order to be measured. Instead, it is strategic because it is designed to achieve a grand objective in pursuit of our national security and interests. Maraming salamat po at mabuhay ang kasandaluhan ng Armed Forces of the Philippines at ang Philippine Coast Guard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commodore J. Tariela, for that very timely discussion. And we will be discussing more of those cyber operations later in our town hall discussion. Our next speaker will be discussing assertive transparency campaigns by the Philippines. So he will be joining us online. So we would like to please welcome Dr. Benjamin Gori-Gothori, team member of Project Myoshu at the Guardian Knot Center for National Security Innovation. He will be joining us from Zoom. Please give him a round of applause.
All right, are you able to hear me over there? Do I have audio? Just doing a comment
Yes,
check.
we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. All right, I was trying to get my screen share to work, but it may not work. I had some slides, but I think I can do without. First of all, just want to say good morning and want to thank everyone for inviting Ray Powell and I to share our latest work. We're exceptionally eager to present this effective and what we think is timely counter-gray zone strategy. I do want to clarify that the views here I share are my own and do not represent those of the U.S. government or its institutions. So this study comes as the South China Sea and especially the West Philippine Sea continues to be a hotbed of gray zone aggression with China as the sole culprit. Some of the activities being island building, the militarization of features, propaganda spreading, resource exploitation, and then the general intimidation tactics like swarming and law enforcement like patrols and water cannoning that have up until recently gone underdocumented and under scrutinized. But in the last year, the Philippines has invented what we've coined assertive transparency over at Sealight. This approach was in large part born from a particularly egregious gray zone incident in February of 2023 near Second Thomas Shoal. A Chinese Coast Guard ship twice blasted a military-grade laser into the bridge of a Philippine patrol vessel, temporarily blinding the crew. The unique part of this was that it was documented firsthand with photographic evidence that was then shared publicly and immediately got the world's attention and generated an uproar across the Philippines and across the world. And for ultimately a response that drove Manila towards what we think will be a remarkably effective counter approach to gray zone aggression. Following that laser incident, the Philippines leadership sort of fully committed to empowering its maritime security forces to document and publicize Chinese vessel swarms, restrictions on Filipinos' legal fishing activities, and environmental damage to marine ecosystems. Shortly after the government started releasing its own information, it turned to its reporters, which legitimized and expanded the program. And by committing to the use of free press, offered a really compelling narrative in the face of Chinese misinformation. So now Philippine vessels are armed with teams of journalists who are ready to document and share run-ins with the Chinese militia to put on display for the world to see the bullying that the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea. And over at Sealight, we labeled this systematic, organized, and deliberate documentation and publication of gray zone aggression as assertive transparency. It seemed to mark a significant departure from the disjointed and often happenstance documentation of previous malign activities, which really could have at best been termed reactive or incidental transparency. So in December, we saw a surge of gray zone activity and some more examples of assertive transparency at play. Three small Philippines Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources ships packing oil subsidy and grocery packs shipped off to resupply Filipino fishing vessels at Scarborough Shoal. And as those 30-meter ships approached the shoal, they were met with two massive 100-meter Chinese Coast Guard ships, which for the next 12 hours harassed, water cannoned, and blocked those resupply ships from getting to the shoal. Those ships carried no weapons, just a set of resupplies and a cadre of journalists who documented and publicized the incident, beaming it across the world, which immediately drew international rebuke of China's actions. A day later, another set of BFAR ships. Oh, that's great. If you could go to the second slide, thank you. My technical expertise got the best of me today. Just a day later, another set of BFAR ships were harassed on a similar visit to Second Thomas Shoal with additional water cannon blasts and even a collision with one of the Chinese Coast Guard vessels. This incident was again broadcast worldwide and painted a stark picture of asymmetry and aggression with the 30-meter BFAR ship contrasted by the 100-meter Coast Guard ship that again drew international condemnation and a sharp reputational loss for China. In an effort to save face, China issued a statement urging the Philippines not to hype up maritime disputes. But the story coming out of the Philippines outstripped any preemptive false narrative or damage control that China tried to push. So put simply, assertive transparency sort of turns on the lights in the gray zone, in the West Philippine Sea and the South China Sea, to seek out and capture and release that gray zone activity, to provide the real story of what's happening in the South China Sea. Ultimately, as we've got it here listed on as the objective, it's to defeat and deter the PRC's aggression. So we knew kind of as this was happening that assertive transparency was going to be critical in the counter gray zone aggression effort. And after observing responses both domestically and globally, we identified these three conditions that are critical to that end, that assertive transparency appears to be really effective at cultivating or propping up, as you see in this image. And we designed this diagram to kind of capture the relationship between assertive transparency and how it feeds into the deter and defeat objective that we've got laid out here. So that first pillar, we can go to the next slide, that we posit assertive transparency supports is to strengthen national resilience. So the public is understandably inclined to prioritize at-home domestic issues like the economy, public education, or public health over things like distant disputes, especially outside of some sort of national security imperative. The assertive transparency brings that national security imperative to the doorstep of the people. It makes the West Philippine Sea disputes unignorable. Citizens now viscerally experience the full extent of gray zone aggression. They see their nation's ships and people blasted by water cannons, denied critical resupplies, and bullied by an international aggressor. And that's reflected in the statistic that was just given, with 72% of Filipinos supporting the defense of the West Philippine Sea. So the idea of national resilience is hard to measure, but domestic policies and rhetoric give us a pretty good proxy for how assertive transparency is moving the needle here. Within just the last 2 months, the Philippines government's committed to building new patrol vessels, acquiring Coast Guard vessels from Japan to beef up their maritime security. They're looking at augmenting their air component with purchases from India. The Philippine legislature is considering large funding increases for its military and Coast Guard, and for the further development of the features that Manila claims. Public officials have also announced their support, kind of reaffirming their commitment to a strong and credible defense posture that can safeguard the Philippines' national interests. In the constant fight against misinformation that's sympathetic to Beijing, which is an issue that's plagued Manila, assertive transparency has at the very least forced propagandists into the public eye. So what's clear here in this first pillar is that assertive transparency is manifesting real domestic policies and heightening awareness of this issue to better resist Chinese transgressions and safeguard those national interests. The next slide, thank you. But in this David versus Goliath scenario, the Philippines can't afford to rely solely on its own resistance to halt the Chinese advance, and that's where we look out externally to build this international support. And we've already observed several examples, especially in the last few months, of increased international support in response to Manila's transparency operations. There's been moral support from Asia, North America, and Europe since the February 2023 incident with the laser. The U.S. has repeatedly reaffirmed its mutual defense treaty obligations, ensuring that China and the world understand that it extends geographically into the West Philippine Sea and to all manner of Philippine public vessels. The Philippines has re-energized security partnerships with Japan. They've entered negotiations with France for a visiting forces agreement, and have reached an agreement with France to increase intelligence and information sharing. The Indian government, which is traditionally non-aligned, expressed support for adherence to international law including the 2016 arbitral tribunal decision that awarded Manila that sweeping victory over Beijing. And then the other front of this is the material assistance element, where we've seen increases in from America, Japan, and Australia in their commitments to conduct joint patrols in disputed waters with the Philippine Navy. Just last week, the U.S. held their third joint patrol with the Philippines in 3 months. The first one being back in November of 2023, and then the second in January of this year. October of last year saw a huge international exercise that drew participants from Australia, Canada, France, Japan, Malaysia, the UK, and the US. And then Canada started providing some state-of-the-art satellite feeds to enable the Philippines to monitor these dark vessels operating within its exclusive economic zone. The combination of material and security commitments that we're seeing sort of flood in are absolutely critical for a sustained anti-gray zone strategy, and indicative of just how effective this assertive transparency operation is. The third pillar, next slide, that is sort of set by assertive transparency shifts the calculus on gray zone aggression. It has the potential to impose some really steep international reputational costs for the bad actor here. Manila's documented Chinese aggression flies in the face of the latter's long-touted win-win relationships in the global South. It remains to be seen whether assertive transparency's clear evidence of Beijing's malign activity will drive foreign nations out of China's arms, and whether that would be felt economically in Beijing. But the more malign activity that assertive transparency reveals, the more likely that Indo-Pacific nations and those along the Belt and Road Initiative will sort of shy away from, or at least be skeptical of, investment opportunities coming out of Beijing. Furthermore, on this side, the G7 grouping of the world's largest or world's leading free economies recently issued a sharp rebuke of China's maritime aggression, reaffirming the 2016 arbitral tribunal, stating that there's no legal basis for China's maritime claims in the West Philippine Sea, and that they continue to oppose China's militarization activities in the region. At the very least, Beijing is being forced to surrender some of the moral high ground that it's so long claimed with every successive assertive transparency operation. Next slide. So to this point, we've not seen assertive transparency stop gray zone aggression in the South China Sea. If anything, we've seen it increase, which is a clear sign that it's effective. It's poking China where it hurts, and it's certainly put them on the back foot. They've been forced to craft and push their own narratives, sort of immediately following these interactions with Philippine vessels, and those narratives have fallen far short of convincing. In the recent water cannoning incidents, China pushed footage of its ships' run-ins with Manila's, but cut the footage just before the water cannoning began in order to trumpet a peaceful interaction. So it's obvious that China intends to counter what we're calling assertive transparency with assertive dishonesty, but up to this point, it's been unsuccessful. Again, we don't expect that assertive transparency will by itself deliver victory in the South China Sea, but it does seem to be a key element to success. As long as these three pillars that we've laid out continue to be cultivated, there's a good chance that this will continue to move the needle on the West Philippine Sea scenario. Some of the we have a few major questions kind of out there that need to be answered. One of which is the Philippines going to go this alone and continue to experience the concentrated brunt of Chinese pressure to cease and desist? Or are we going to see other nations sort of pick up cameras and follow suit, right? Ultimately, the other big part of this is assertive transparency needs time to aggregate effects. This is kind of an area under the curve matter. And so being able to resist that pressure and continue to release this information for the world to see is going to be critical. Third, the assertive transparency as an operation needs to find itself in a comprehensive, ideally transnational strategy for countering gray zone aggression. And in the era of misinformation, there's a really stark challenge to it being effective long term. So identifying what conditions, tactics, documentation, and distribution will allow the narrative born of assertive transparency to kind of rise above those trumpeted by gray zone aggressors will be really critical to its long-term success. Otherwise, it runs the risk of being lost in the noise of false narratives. We're also interested in the other domains in which this might be relevant. Assertive transparency doesn't seem to be limited to the maritime domain, but may have some really broad application. How does it come into play for contested airspace, for dangerous spacecraft maneuvers, cyber attacks, narcotics trafficking, environmental degradation, economic or political coercion? So we want to see the adoption of assertive transparency sort of spread across these different domains. We are seeing this theory stress tested, though, in the West Philippine Sea, and it's giving us a really clear sense of its effectiveness as a counter gray zone approach. The initial successes sort of demand further commitment to the strategy. There is a lot of upside remaining as the world is just now taking note of its efficacy. So ultimately, what we hope to see at Sealight is the effective and widespread adoption in the fight against gray zone actors in the South China Sea and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Benjamin Gorigothari, for that discussion on assertive transparency campaigns by the Philippines. To discuss the results of our study on China's information warfare in the Philippines, we would like to welcome our next speaker, the Communications and Advocacy Director of the Strat-based Group, Ms. Mary Joyce Ilas Reyes.
All right, thank you, Shanice. And again, I'm Joyce Ilas Reyes. I'm the Communications and Advocacy Director of the Strat-based Institute, and my presentation today is about is based on the paper that I wrote last December on China's information warfare. Are we using our presentation? All right, so okay. So before we discuss what China is doing in the Philippines, it would be best to understand first why China is doing these things. So let's start with the first slide. Okay. China's main objective is to ensure global influence and control to achieve its expansionist China dream. Its ultimate objective is to be the all-powerful hegemon power and to bring back its former imperial grandeur as the Middle Kingdom, or to be the center of civilization, or to be the center of the world. So applying that here in the Philippines, China's main objective in the country is first to perpetuate its expansionism agenda and basically cement the 9-dash, or now the 10-dash line. And also, China hopes to cut Philippines' treaty alliance with the United States and remove their bases in the Philippines. Next slide, please. So how do they plan to do this? China aims to achieve the China dream without having to fire a single shot. This belief was deeply influenced by Sun Tzu's Art of War, which prompted subduing the enemy without having to fight, instead using economic, social, and political actions as alternatives to military means. And in Mao Zedong's thoughts, who believed that politics is war without bloodshed, and also advocated for an armed struggle in conjunction with the other forms of struggles. Now, these ideologies, which I initially learned from General Manny Bautista here, eventually gave birth to China's gray zone activities, which our previous speakers discussed earlier. So now one form of this gray zone operation is the information warfare. Next slide, please. China aims to ensure that foreign governments, including its elites, journalists, and civil society, will accept its manipulated narrative and abstain from criticizing its actions and behaviors in their own country. As of 2015, China was reported to be investing about 10 billion US dollars a year for its influence operations, which includes a massive disinformation campaign in the different parts of the world. Now, this number is perceived to have gotten significantly higher over the years. Next slide, please. So how does disinformation happen? Now, a deeper look into various disinformation campaigns in the Philippines, which we also compare to the other disinformation campaigns of China and the other parts of the world, showed that the campaign primarily starts with the strategic political operators, which specialize in social engineering. I'm not sure if are they big enough so you can see. And so social engineering aims to manipulate and misrepresent incidents, issues, and public discourse to sway public opinion or public policy in favor of a specific interest or agenda. Now, in the case of China's information warfare in the Philippines, this may include Chinese political leaders and groups who then connect with Filipino political leaders, media operators, and key opinion leaders to propagate their messaging. Now, the message is then further sent to both authentic, but most especially inauthentic social media followers and network, which further amplify the narrative until it reaches the general public, who the operators hope would voluntarily proliferate the message that they have already started. Right? Next slide, please. So let us discuss social engineering. As we know, in the Philippines, political leaders play a key role not just in shaping public discourse, but in crafting public policies that affect the entire nation. So at this point, we will be using former President Duterte as a case study on how social engineering happened here in the Philippines. So when the arbitral award was released in 2016, it was met with silence by the Duterte administration. This was earlier mentioned in the opening speech of Sir Dindo and also by Commodore J. Tariela. So I'll give you a short preview or a small snippet of how that dark times, which Sir Dindo said, happened. So instead of acting on the arbitral ruling, President Duterte adopted a friendly stance with China despite its continued reclamation and other illegal actions in the Philippine waters. So I'm sure our friends from the media can remember when President Duterte said these statements, especially that part where he said that he wants us to be Philippines, province of China. I remember there was even a time where there were banners everywhere which said, "Welcome to the Philippines, province of China." Yep. And then during his term, President Duterte also ensured China of the full recovery of the Philippines-China bilateral relations and even ordered the Philippine government's military and economic separation from the United States. So yeah, that's what he said. He said that he will be dependent on China. Next slide, please. Now, Duterte also repeatedly said that the Philippines cannot stop China's actions in the West Philippine Sea and even repeatedly downplayed the presence of Chinese vessels inside the Philippine territory. That was his narrative that time. He just repeatedly said that we will lose to China. Now, all the while, aggressive activities by the Chinese Coast Guard and militia vessels continued to take place in the West Philippine Sea, including reclaiming areas and building facilities in Philippine waters. We have to note that during his term, the president or the former president had multiple meetings with the Chinese embassy and also visited China several times. Initially, China promised the former president $24 billion worth of investment deals, but as we know, those did not materialize. In 2018, the former president also said that Xi Jinping promised to protect him from plans of coup d'etat against him, insinuating that the Chinese presence in the West Philippine Sea was actually meant to secure his post. So that's his line, actually. He said that he believes China will not allow him to be taken out of his post. And so as the chief architect of the country's foreign policy, the former president's statements, whether factual or misinformed, and whether it contained benevolent aspirations or had malign intentions, were considered policy by his government and the rest of the country. This is what Commodore J was saying earlier. In fact, I was able to talk to a credible source from the military who said that they had to stand down from releasing information about and taking actions against continuous Chinese coercive and aggressive activities in the West Philippine Sea during the Duterte administration. They wanted to speak, but they couldn't, which is actually what Commodore Che said also. So next slide, please. The measure of success of China's information warfare in the country is whether or not it was able to change or influence public policy to favor its interests. Now, looking back at China's objectives vis-a-vis the actions and pronouncements of the former president from 2016 to 2022, I think we can see that China was able to effectively push its agenda. China was able to seize control of some parts of the West Philippine Sea from 2016 to 2022. And it was also during the term of the former president that the Philippine government loosened, if not entirely cut its ties with one of its strongest allies, the United States, and pivoted to China. Okay, next slide. So at the height of the friendly relations between Beijing and Manila, China also reinforced its influence operations involving the Philippine media. Duterte and Xi Jinping even signed an agreement, a memorandum of understanding, which involved China inviting and sponsoring trips and media trainings for Filipino journalists and from state and private media outlets to China. A 2020 report of the International Federation of Journalists noted that there is actually a consensus in the media community that these Chinese-sponsored trainings have favorable impact to China. That they saw considerable change in the attitude or in the way some of these journalists wrote their stories after going to China and doing their trainings, and also the leisurely trip. Opinion articles favoring China and at one point even discrediting the 2016 arbitral ruling were also published in both state and private news agencies during the Duterte administration. I think this is an example of an opinion article that was published in the state news media online, I think online version. There. Fast forward to 2022, the change in the administration also saw a change in Philippine foreign policy, and China had to act accordingly. With the state-run news agencies no longer heavily favoring China, it is now focusing its influence operations on private news companies and even individual Filipino journalists. The National Security Council said last year that the strategy now is to engage private news agencies and publish news content that echoes the Chinese narrative, which Commodore J also mentioned earlier. So the NSC said that there are some reporters and news agencies which accept the statements of the Chinese embassy and some Chinese officials hook, line, and sinker and publish them verbatim as if they are facts. There were instances when there was no attribution to the source of the quote or statement qualifiers, such as the words allege or claim, making the wrongful claims sound factual. Although I'm sure our friends from the media who's here with us are not among those who are doing that. Yeah. Okay, next slide, please. Now we go to inauthentic amplification. President Marcos Jr.'s pivot to a multipolar world forced China to also adjust its disinformation campaign in the Philippines and turn heavily to inauthentic amplification, which is using inauthentic personalities or those who are pretending to be someone they are not, such as using fake accounts or paid trolls on social media platforms, and also fake experts or sensational influencers who are compensated to echo the interests of their benefactors to their followers. Next slide, please. So we are already quite familiar with how paid trolls work. So in the interest of time, allow me to just talk more about false experts or sensational influencers and even think tanks who are heavily biased towards the Chinese narrative, which China is using in its inauthentic amplification operations. So authorities said that these personalities present themselves as credible foreign policy and national security experts and even as legitimate journalists. Several reports quoting government officials identified at least 2 think tanks and several experts to be among those who are parroting China's narrative, as seen from their Facebook posts and in the statements they issued. I'm not sure if it's big enough if you can see what they are saying here, how they are parroting the Chinese narrative. But their messaging includes projecting and redirecting the issue, often accusing the United States of influencing Filipinos and controlling the Philippine oligarchs and even the mass media. They also utilize statistics and data and twist them to favor their narrative. Now, these pro-China content are also reportedly being funneled and propagated into hyper-partisan pro-China Facebook groups. Now, to give you an example, okay. Yeah, I think the size changed there. So to give you an example, that one there from Asian Century, a Pulse Asia survey conducted on September 2023 asked Filipinos to identify the most urgent national concerns. So among those most urgent national concerns, only 7% said defending the integrity of Philippine territory against foreigners is among the most urgent concerns. So one group took this to mean that only 7% of Filipinos are concerned about defending the Philippine territory. Now, the NSA said that this information was actually taken out of context because while many Filipinos do not find the issue urgent, because there are more urgent concerns for them, considering their socioeconomic situation, it does not mean that they are not concerned at all about the West Philippine Sea issue. There are several other surveys which show that a vast majority of Filipinos support the government's efforts in the West Philippine Sea, and we'll give you more details on that later on. So in the spirit of fairness, we will include their responses in the presentation, on their answers on these accusations or on these report. So they are basically saying that they claim they are not pro-China, but they are pro-Philippines and they are pro-peace. They also said that they participated in activities critical of China as well, but when asked what these are, they could not identify, or they did not identify what these were. They, however, also argued that they are only advocating for stronger relations with China because they believe it would be beneficial for the Philippines. So next slide. Okay. So the Assertive Transparency campaign was already discussed comprehensively by the previous speakers. So I will no longer expound on that, but insofar as responses to this information is concerned, alongside the government's transparency efforts, legitimate national security and foreign policy experts, some of them are here, I can see them here, including various academic institutions and think tanks, and the diplomatic community, including some of them we have been working with here, have been working together and have been stepping up their campaign to defend the rules-based international order and the Philippine sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea, and calling out China's disinformation campaign through various fora, lectures, and publications. The support of the international community also proved crucial, as mentioned earlier. Since last year, a number of foreign envoys have been delivering statements supporting the 2016 Arbitral Award, favoring the Philippines, defending the rules-based international order, and the Philippine sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea. So next slide. So in conclusion, as I mentioned earlier, there are various surveys this year which showed the Filipino people's low trust in China amid continuous gray zone activities in the West Philippine Sea, and the public's increasing support towards the government's actions to defend our rights in the West Philippine Sea. So I'm not sure if you can see it, but these surveys show the low trust of Filipinos to China. Here it said that only in 2022, 31.5% had no confidence to China, and 50% had little confidence. Okay, next slide. And then the majority of the Filipino public also believe that the Philippine government should continue to strengthen its alliances with like-minded states, with China ranking low in the survey. The desire of Filipinos to continuously defend the country's sovereignty vis-a-vis the declining trust towards China show that the Philippines is winning the information warfare initiated by China in the country. So next slide. Recommendations. But the information warfare is far from over. There are still a lot that needs to be done to ensure that we will retain the upper hand, especially with China being expected to continue its gray zone operations in the West Philippine Sea alongside its information warfare in the country. A whole of society approach is critical in addressing disinformation. The Philippine government, with the help and support of the Filipino public, Legitimate experts from think tanks and the academe, journalists, the private sector, and civil society organizations must continue to utilize and proliferate the truth to counter China's false narratives. There is also a need to continuously release statements and publicize photos and videos of Chinese gray zone operations in the West Philippine Sea. There is also a need to continuously and steadfastly assert our rights in our territory. This also includes publishing a new Philippine standard map, which will determine the extent of the Philippine territory and which will abide by the UNCLOS. There is also a need to educate the public about the Philippine territory and sovereignty. A bill can be passed to incorporate in the basic education curriculum the significance of the 2016 Arbitral Award and its importance to Filipinos. Surprisingly, not a lot of Filipinos are actually familiar with what the arbitral ruling is all about. There are also even Filipinos who do not know the difference between the West Philippine Sea and the South China Sea. So that is, I think, very important for them to understand what is the worth of this ruling. And it will also help instill nationalism and patriotism in Filipinos at a young age and will prevent them from being controlled. Most importantly, this will prevent them from being controlled and swayed by foreign information warfare. Now, as the survey showed earlier, Filipinos believe there is a need to continuously strengthen our alliances with like-minded states. The Philippines can also learn from the United States Foreign Agents Registration Act, which requires agents of foreign principals or sponsors, especially those who present themselves as experts or influencers, to make a public disclosure of their relationship with their foreign principals, including the extent of their sponsored activities, payments received, and disbursements made in support of the political actions. If you're familiar with how TikTok or Facebook works, if you are an endorser or if you are speaking in behalf of a client, sometimes you'll see there on the upper side under your name, it says sponsored, something like that. So that would be very necessary. So people who are listening to what you are saying, especially if you are an expert, can make a better decision. So on whether or not to believe what you're saying. So having a similar policy in the Philippines will help Filipinos make a more informed decision when listening or reading statements or releases by these agents. Social media companies such as Facebook and X, formerly Twitter, should also be stringent in enforcing its policies against troll armies, fake accounts, and propaganda pages or groups, especially because these are being used to harass legitimate experts, just like what Commodore J said earlier. There is also, lastly, this is also very important, there is a need for Filipinos to vote wisely during elections and support candidates who are sincere about defending the country's sovereignty. Filipino voters must learn how to be discerning and see beyond the false promises of politicians during the campaign period. Else we get a repeat of what happened from 2016 to 2022. And thank you for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Mary Joyce Ilas Reyes, for that interesting discussion. So we continue to discuss Chinese strategies for malign influence in Asia and the Pacific. To discuss more about this issue, we would like to call on stage Mr. Karel Galang, Senior Program Officer of the Asia Democracy Network.
Thank you very much, StratBase, for the invitation and Your Excellencies, partners, allies. Thank you very much for being here and listening to our presentation. So I am from a non-government organization based in Seoul named the Asia Democracy Network. So if you want to sue me after saying things here after my presentation, do not. Just sue my organization instead. So my contact detail is there because I forgot my cards as well. So next slide, please. So just indulge me for a bit of an introduction about my organization, which is a regional organization composed of several of the largest human rights and democracy organizations spread all over Asia. So we are composed of more than 300 organizations spread over 30 countries, but we do have 11 regional partners. Uh, and here they are. So for more information, there is a QR code in there. You can scan it. Next slide, please. So our organization's goals are threefold. Essentially to promote democratic unity and solidarity among democracy actors, empower the next generation of democracy advocates, and advocate strong democratic institutions. And that is why we are here, to actually advocate for strong democratic institutions, because we are what I'm presenting is from the point of view of civil society organizations on how they can get involved in countering these malign influences, uh, penetrating their countries or penetrating their states. Next slide, please. So we do have two publications already published. One is China's Rise Under the Lens. I wrote this with fellow academician, Mr. Cleve Arguelles. And another is just released last year, the China Gambit, and which will be the focus of my presentation today. Copies of the two publications are here. If you want a copy as well, given by email, you can also just send me a message. Okay, let me start. Next slide, please. So I will not be discussing very specific details on presented, but I will be presenting on the parallel narratives happening in the four target countries that we covered, namely the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and Fiji. So we aim to surface Asian narratives, Asia-Pacific narratives, and local narratives on how China's actions have affected their efforts to democratize or strengthen the democratic institutions, to promote and defend democracy and human rights in their respective countries and trigger possible advocacies and capacity building of local stakeholders. So we also aim to produce an expository, explanatory, revelatory, and seminal report to help inform public discourse, which, the book contains a timeline of interventions from 2015 to current, and documented events from perspective of on-the-ground actors. And ultimately, we seek to expose sharp power tactics done by China. What do we mean by sharp power tactics? These are actions which China used to project their influence internationally with the objectives of limiting free expression, spreading confusion, and undermining and distorting political environment within these democracies that we covered. And sharp power is an approach by in international affairs that typically involve efforts at censorship, the use of manipulation to sap the integrity of independent democratic institutions. So why did we title the report a gambit? So a gambit, in essence, is a very dangerous move because in time of war or in time of peace, a gambit is employed to open doors, deploy a plan, or simply achieve desired results. By all accounts, a gambit is playing between China and the local actors within the cover and the four target countries that we mentioned. But unfortunately, nearly all the benefits go to the Chinese actors, and all the repercussions, and well, not only the Chinese actors but also their allies on the ground. If you were going to ask me if they are here, they most probably are, and they benefit from this gambit that is happening between the actors in China. And but all the what do you call this? All the cost of this gambit is borne by the people, the economy, the democratic institutions, and the rights and the welfare of the citizens. And all of this just to assert its role, for China to assert its role as a global superpower, uh, uh, which has negative impacts on democratic and human rights uh, uh, regime in the world now. Next, no, I'll stay in that slide, previous slide. So how does China conduct these sharp power tactics? Uh, of course, the number one tactic is to, of course, reshape the landscape for it to favor you. So China has done powerful moves to utilize economic and diplomatic heft, like the creation of the Belt and Road Initiative, challenge the norms and global orders, special institutions of global governance like the United Nations, and create parallel or alternative institutions like the AIB, all to create a landscape that reflects its own image and values that make China's rise more acceptable. These moves, however, create ripples which impact lives, freedoms, livelihoods, and communities. And like all superpower, China's actions and the repercussions should be dissected, assessed, and held into account. So why influence the four countries? Fiji, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Thailand are Asia Pacific's most dynamic and integrated economies and hold significant political sway in the region. So CCP's intermediators have been actively operating in these four spaces, given their strategic geopolitical importance for China. So Thailand and Indonesia, for instance, control the parts of the Malacca Strait in tandem with Malaysia and Singapore, where up to two-thirds of China's maritime trade volume and around 60% of its entire oil supply pass through. Meanwhile, the Philippines controls the West Philippine Sea, where around $1.5 trillion worth of Chinese trade happens, as well as several choke points uh, such as the Bashi Channel, and which serves as an access to the Pacific. Meanwhile, Fiji serves as a diplomatic hub in the Pacific, which Chinese government eyes constantly given the several of the Pacific nations' recognition of Taiwan. So there is an interplay happening between the domestic and CCP interests. And the effect of the ripples that I mentioned earlier are more pronounced in still democratizing states, spaces like the Indonesia and the Philippines, and in spaces which face tremendous challenges to fully democratize, like Fiji and Thailand. So these four battleground spaces, as we call them, feature governance structures which are not yet fully developed or are in a state of stagnation and are plagued with powerful domestic interests. Um, these conditions mingling with China's aggressive influence peddling creates effects so corrosive to democracy that are accentuated by corruption, patronages, and repression of freedoms, among others. Actors in these battleground spaces face a delicate balancing act. On one hand, grappling with the risk posed by China's assertive behavior and apathetic attitudes towards human rights concerns, and on the other hand, the alluring political and economic benefits and the protection and friendship of a superpower. For actors in these four democratizing states, dealing with China indeed presents a gambit involving intricate considerations and trade-offs. So one of the uh, biggest tools or more biggest tools that China used to sort of assert its dominance in the regions, sort of use the gospel of the BRI. So the BRI, together with loans, development aid, and other economic and diplomatic measures, have become China's tools to incentivize, coerce, and co-opt actors in these countries. So the BRI alone is estimated to have 1 trillion to 8 trillion worth of investments, and is seen by many countries as an attractive developmental resource. So governments in the four countries during the time that the BRI was launched were also launching their own developmental plans. So the Global Maritime Fulcrum in Indonesia launched in 2014, the Build in the Philippines launched in 2017, Thailand 4.0 in 2016, and its centerpiece, the Eastern Economic Corridor, and transforming Fiji 5-year and 20-year National Development Plan launched in 2017. So some of these economic and development plans would not have been able to be launched without the support of China at that time. But what is that? Next page, please. So at the same time that these developmental projects or developmental plans were launched, there is also a trend of growing authoritarianism. Thank you, in the region. So leaders in the four countries were more than willing to accept China's helping hand despite concerns of the debt trap diplomacy surrounding the BRI. Uh, why? Because unlike its Western counterparts, China's conditionalities do not require partner governments to adopt human rights conditionalities, transparency conditionalities, among others, as a requisite for the deals. And for these countries, these are very attractive. It is important to note that at the same time that these developmental plans were launched, leaders of the four countries were facing heavy scrutiny over their human rights and democratic practices. So uh, during this time, for instance, Jokowi was turning more anti-secular and nationalistic. Duterte, as we all know, is doing his war on drugs, which killed thousands. Uh, Prayut has been filing a lot of these strategic litigations against public participations in Thailand, given that he has to quell public dissent after his coup in 2014. And Fiji's president has been comfortable with his position after the coup that he led in 2006. But meanwhile, what made China attractive during those times was, of course, they have no choice as well because they perceive the West as distancing themselves from these regimes, and China was more than happy to fill the gap. Now, what aggravated the damage was there are weak and compromised institutions in the four target countries that we mentioned. After years of illiberal control in the case of Fiji and Thailand, or the stagnation of democracy in the Philippines and Indonesia, regulatory institutions have been rendered compromised, inefficient, or sometimes failing. Taking advantage of institutional weakness, CCP was able to penetrate and conduct its influence peddling through its effective United Front work, which is an official branch within the CCP, bureaucracy, which seeks to, present propaganda and sanitize China's, presence or sanitize China's identity in the international stage. Advocates of CCP in the four target countries were able to tighten relationships, court and capture political economic elites through their aggressive people-to-people and sometimes party-to-party charm offensive, which goes even to the length of funding some political candidates or sometimes supporting or tightening ties with local media institutions. No? Sharp power and cultural offensives. So this report essentially, as I've mentioned, uh, covers several political, economic, sociocultural, uh, interferences that happened during that time. And this report documents how China was able to penetrate communities through their strongly forged relationships with media in the four countries. CCP was able to conduct a cultural offensive where Chinese propaganda was able to spread like wildfire. CCP's agents were able to gain goodwill in the target countries through exchange programs for print and multimedia journalists and media executives, and provision of equipment support, which was then reciprocated with content sharing agreements and even circulation of opinion pieces or tweet diplomacy by wolf-wire diplomats in the daily newspapers. A similar charm patrol was done through the academic sector, with opportunities for scholarship programs, joint cultural events and training seminars focusing on students, teachers, civil servants, and security personnel, with tighter relationships forged between Chinese and domestic academic actors. We all know that there is a sprouting of Confucius institutes all around the four target countries and even here in the Philippines. No, they are being built left and right, and CCP was able to capture spaces through projects, activities, and actions tailor-fitted to the most basic concerns and needs of the local communities. And in Fiji, in the case of Fiji, for instance, these go as specific as the provision, for instance, of sewing machines to local communities. So there are big promises that China presented, however, but there are bad results as well. And CCP's actors were able to get what they want with their domestic partners. Most of the deals that happened under the BRI and other this party-to-party and people-to-people, bargaining happened under the table with no transparency. So with weak institutions, the mutualism that exists between CCP and the domestic partners, it's ultimately the common people who are often left without any form of redress when deals become deployed, fail, or produce bad results. I mean, who can criticize China? Even Chinese citizens cannot criticize the government, right? So much worse, government responses on these adverse impacts of China projects on the environment, the harassment of violations of workers, and bad corporate practices in the four countries are almost non-existent. Uh, while countries may face public censure and pressure from their own citizens, the CCP's tight grip on freedom of expression in China is not possible. States' silence on censorship pertaining to China's actions on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet also happen, and a message of firm embrace of one China policy have also become a bargaining chip for China's goodwill to continue. So, to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. So these are some of the interventions that were discussed in the book. These are some of the economic and business interventions, wherein, as we mentioned, there are people-to-people exchanges happening. Next slide, please. Some of them also involve some political, diplomatic, and military interventions that happening between the Chinese army and the army or the military of the four target countries. And finally, next slide, please. Some socio-cultural interventions, which I mentioned, which deals on cultural offensives in the four target countries. And so as a member of the civil society, next slide, please. I would like to propose some recommendations. There are a lot of members of there are members of the diplomatic community here present. And I would like to urge you to connect with local civil society organizations and people organizations to strengthen their capacity on these points. So number one is public education. So there needs to be proper nuancing of the issue. As we discovered, a lot of these discussions happen. They're a bit highfalutin for local, people to consume and to understand. And there needs to be proper dissemination and access to the scattered resources that happen to be lying around. Media. Unfortunately, we need to strengthen our media institutions as well because they are among the most vulnerable right now to be, influenced, given that there are some, given the issues of disinformation as well as the weakening or the spread of the use of internet, which dilutes sort of their presence. No? The disclosure policies regarding agreements between domestic and media and Chinese media, and enhanced mechanisms to monitor pro-CCP media and narratives. Next, please. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, there is a need to capacitate local stakeholders on how do we actually dissect, how do we actually understand China and their interventions in our spaces. And there needs to be proper education in this on China literacy, how it penetrates our democratic institutions. So I think I will stop there, and if there are some questions, I would be happy to respond and add to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Karel Galang, for that presentation as well. So our last speaker will be discussing how local influencers in the Philippines localize propaganda by the People's Republic of China. To discuss more about digital spaces as contested areas for information, please welcome Dr. Alvin Camba, Assistant Professor at the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. So he will be joining us virtually. Please give him a round of applause.
Oh, hi everybody. How are you? I'm sorry. I'm trying to I'm trying to put my PowerPoint. I'm trying to share it. It doesn't seem to be working. It's okay. I think I can just speak on my own without sharing the PowerPoint. Although let me try it again. Sorry. I'm just give me a minute. I should have done this a while ago. Okay. Yeah, yeah, my PowerPoint is not working. I have no idea how. I have no idea why. I think I have to do the system preferences quickly. And then I'm just gonna share it right away. Quit and reopen. Okay, I think I can share it right now. Before I start, I would like to remind everybody of 2 points though, especially when it comes to like the question of China. I think the first thing is that we have to understand that Chinese history is very complicated. I think this idea of like an overwhelming threat of like what the Chinese brings is it's basic. The China is an overwhelming threat to many countries is while it's becoming truer today, it's actually way more complicated, like historically speaking. Like before 2013, before Xi Jinping's rise, it was way more complicated, and the CCP was basically a hostage to business elites in China. And sort of like the idea that China's rise is sort of like, okay, this is an actor, this is a country that's out to get everybody. That needs to be like nuanced and that needs to be focused away more. I think the second thing is that we have to understand that there are many types of Chinese actors in the Philippines and across the world. You're looking at like, millions of Chinese companies, and you're looking at okay, I got a message from them. Which message? Yeah, it's not working actually. I have to like apparently leave Zoom to sort of like send it to for it to work. I'm sorry, this is a new laptop, so it's a new laptop, so therefore it's like I have to like what do you call this? It's a new laptop, therefore I have to configure Zoom to basically send it. I'm gonna send it right now quickly. Maybe I can like speak a bit more about like this topic while I'm here in a way. I think the second thing is that I've studied Chinese development finance and direct investments for the longest time. I literally have studied wait where should I send the email? Stratbase. Which email should I send this? Which email should I send my PowerPoint to? Then you can tell me, then I'm gonna send it right away. Okay. So, but okay, just gonna go to this person. Thank you. Yeah, apologies for this. Okay, I send it to you right now. So the second thing I would like to add is that I've studied Chinese development finance and direct investments for the longest time. And we're really looking at like millions of Chinese actors going on across the world. You're looking at, let's say, thousands of Chinese companies, many types of government officials. I would say the degree to which the Chinese government can sort of like control these actors to forward their goals is complicated as well. I'm not saying that Chinese actors do not constitute a security threat. They definitely do, specifically particular types of government actors such as the United Front. But we have to be cognizant that the idea of an overwhelming geopolitical threat that China is out to sort of like infiltrate institutions and sort of like do many terrible things. That doesn't really happen in other parts of the world. It's far more complicated. So we have to be careful of our narratives and our analysis. And we always have to ground this in very, very clear empirical data and research. That's a second point. I sent you the PowerPoint. If you could open it, thank you so much. I'm sorry for this. Thank you. So I'm basically gonna talk about the 5 types of digital propaganda, how local influencers forward Chinese interest in the Philippines. Good evening, right now from Virginia. My name is Alvin Camba. I'm an assistant professor at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. I'm also a faculty member at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Next slide, please. So I think this is what I was talking about a while ago regarding my 2 points. I would say in the last 10 years, I've published over like 50 academic articles and book chapters. I've worked with American think tanks, including Carnegie Endowment, CIPE, etc. And I really find that number one, China is really becoming more dangerous to many countries across the world. If you study China historically since the 90s, despite it being a communist government, it really wasn't like that before. It was far more circumscribed. It's a more powerful, more pronounced economic actor. And sort of the dangers that the Philippines actually faced with China emerged by 2013, 2012, when Xi Jinping actually came in. Although we did have a dispute with them over the Mischief Reef, and obviously our former president, Gloria Arroyo, was involved in some rent-seeking activities with Chinese companies. Next slide, please. Now, last year, I basically published the Philippine chapter of this report with the International Republican Institute, countering China's information manipulation in Indo-Pacific and Kazakhstan, where I basically wrote the Philippine chapter of this report. Next slide, please. Now, in this report, I'm gonna get sued for this, but whatever. I basically live here anyway. Now, in this report, I basically focus on sort of like the role of certain influencers, in the country. They're famous. I mean, I don't need to like. I mean, they're way more famous than like than any of us, unfortunately. Not Richard Heydarian, of course. Richard's a good guy. But this is a picture with Richard, and this is a Sasasot as we know her. There's Herman Q. Laurel, there's like Mark Lopez, etc. I mean, they publish a lot of, I would say, PRC friendly social media posts. They've been doing this for like 10 years. So it's not like I'm like shaming them or anything that they do publish these things. Although just to be clear, there's really no explicit, I would say, proof that they are paid for by the PRC. Nonetheless, their actions constitute otherwise, as we all know. Just to be clear, it's hard to their effectiveness comes from the fact that it's actually hard to find proof that they are really like sort of paid for by the PRC. I mean, except for you may be looking at their bank accounts or looking at other forms of financial transfers. It's impossible to know. There's research in Europe saying that there's recent research that has argued that PRC influencers in Europe are paid for using cryptocurrency through stocks as well. So there are many forms that these people get paid. Nonetheless, whether they get paid or not, what we can agree on is that they do forward Chinese influence in the Philippines. And in some ways, this presentation, next slide, please. This presentation, I simply look at the question of how do Philippine social media influencers, hereafter influencers, forward the People's Republic of China's, forward the PRC's propaganda. Next slide, please. I argue that social media influencers enact 5 types, basically credentialing, selective expertise, discrediting, misconstruing, and shaming. Next slide, please. Now, the academic literature or even the policy literature hasn't really sort of looked at this. You basically have 2 different literatures. One literature focuses on Chinese propaganda and the United Front, sort of like foreign policy influence. Friends of mine, such as Matt Schrader from ADRi, friends of mine from ASPI, they work on these things. And then you have a more academic, non-China literature focusing on disinformation. Per se, you have Jonathan Ong from like UMass Amherst, who sort of like looks at what he calls the agents of disinformation. You have Feldstein, etc. Nonetheless, the literature doesn't really look at sort of like how do influencers take on a sort of like a localized form of how do they sort of localize this sort of like foreign forms of like influences. How do influencers localize foreign propaganda and how they forward it in the particular context? Next slide, please. In this case, I basically argue the social media influencers forward influence by credentialing, selective expertise, discrediting, misconstruing, and shaming. Now the question is, which Chinese institution is it? As I open this presentation, I basically made an argument that there are millions of Chinese actors. Not all Chinese actors do these things, right? Most likely, it is the United Front Work Department, which does not explicitly belong to the Chinese government. It belongs to the CCP or the Chinese Communist Party. Similar to the PLA, if you think about the People's Liberation Army, it is actually not an army of the Chinese government. It is an army of the Chinese Communist Party. So this is a Communist Party institution. And then obviously that means the people in a Communist Party, and then they sort of like influence and shape the government, do forward certain activities. And in many ways, they are disconnected and autonomous from, I would say, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they're from Ministry of Commerce. Not to say they don't work together. Empirically, it's hard to know that, but we do know they operate autonomously from research that other people have done before. Next slide, please. Credentialing. Now I'm basically gonna define them one by one. Credentialing is when influencers use their credentials to buttress certain points rather than use substance. Selective expertise is to arbitrarily accept certain experts or authorities but reject others. Discrediting pertains to linking competing figures to US-backed agencies. So for instance, in the report that I've published before, they basically said I was a CIA agent or I was paid for by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is really weird because it's really hard to get funding from the NED as somebody who has actually applied to the NED before. Misconstruing is when influencers misinterpret the argument and create a straw person argument to attack. Shaming points to assailing features, traits, and ties of the competing figures. In other words, rather than engage debate or enrich discussions on these topics, these 5 types of digital propaganda recenter discussions on trivial and irrelevant matters. Next slide, please. Why before I talk about the sort of like the 5 types of like the five types of digital propaganda, I'm gonna bring up why are they so effective. Influencers refract PRC propaganda through social norms that refract or are familiar among a wider variety of Filipino audiences. Influencers personalize this disinformation acts by putting their personality stamps in the message. This is a process that I tentatively call influencer populism, in which the principle of familiarity or the degree to which the audience can identify with the influencer as a friend or a family member. Sass, for instance, is a flamboyant yet smart individual. Mark Lopez is a rude and straightforward uncle. Malindog Oy is a down-to-earth academic. In contrast, if we sort of look at other sort of academic and influencers such as Richard Haydarian or Punong Bayan, for instance, they're legitimate sort of like thinkers in the Philippines and good academics in the in legitimate academics in the Asian context. They refract a lot of elitism, which doesn't really connect with like most Filipino social media users. So what makes PRC influencers so effective is the fact that they can connect, they can personalize, and they can recenter their sort of like personal familiarity with like the readers of these messages. Next slide, please. In this particular case, the first one is credentialing. So basically, I have 2 pictures here. One picture is when Sasa Sot was called herself an international relations expert and a docent in Leiden University, which is a university in the Netherlands. I think I'm not sure if it's in The Hague. I forgot. But funny enough, the way people talk about her is she's a professor as if she has a permanent position. She's a docent. A docent basically is an adjunct. An adjunct is somebody who is paid in a very particular part-time way, which is totally fine. I respect those people. But obviously, she sort of like took on the personality and sort of like this like credentialing as a professor, even though that's actually not even her position. Similarly, Malindog Oy in this other article talks about how she's a professor, she's an expert in these topics, and she basically publishes in journals, but she actually doesn't even do research at all if you sort of look at her academic articles. Nonetheless, what happened if you look at her articles, she doesn't have academic articles, unfortunately. Nonetheless, next slide, please. The effect of credentialing is expertise is questionable at best. So their expertise is questionable at best. But what effectively happens is that they accept some expertise, but not others. And then this basically buttresses certain points. It gives them some aura of credibility as if they can speak about these topics. And then funny enough, you can actually find many of our social media influencers in the Philippines in Chinese media. So if you go to People's Daily or CGT, and you're basically going to find like Sasasot or like Malindog Oy or like Herman Tiu Laurel talking to the Chinese media, basically telling the Chinese media that US agents have infiltrated the Philippines and most Filipinos actually don't want the United States. That's what they say in Chinese media. Next slide, please. The next one is what we call selective expertise. This is when influencers draw on certain experts, but then they reject others. So in one example, I'm sorry, this is like too small. In the example on the left, Sasot cited an article by this RSIS academic. RSIS is this like think tank / academic institution. It's a policy school in Singapore in Nanyang Technological University. And this academic from RSIS talks about how the South China Sea is a contested sort of like area, and then the ships in the South China Sea don't just represent what you call Chinese. They say the Chinese Navy. It's actually represented by local, let's say, Fujianese or like Guangdong sort of like fishing ships going to the South China Sea. And basically, what Sasot is doing is basically to say that, oh, okay, well, look at their Philippine exports. They basically ignored real exports, particularly those in Singapore. Similarly, what Mark Lopez does here on the right is he basically posted a video by Kihore Mabobani, who is the former dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School in NUS. And, Kihore talks about how it's actually America's nefarious plan to sort of like get China to be involved in the South China Sea, and the South China Sea issue is some sort of like, what do you call this? Some sort of like it's like an American narrative, but there's an Asian narrative that's different. So next slide, please. What's interesting here in selective expertise is that expertise here is signaled but not explained. A lot of these influencers claim that, okay, this is what the experts are saying, but they don't really bring up the sort of like the substantive arguments around it. More importantly, influencers bring up legitimate academics. For instance, the RSI's academic or Mabubani to some degree, but they miss out. But they miss the idea that the arguments of these academics are simply positions. They are far from being a consensus in the academic literature. For instance, the RSI's academic published in a solid Singapore journal, but it's not really published in a cutting-edge academic journal. No, I'm not going to go into some academic elitism here and say that, okay, well, they have to publish in a top journal. It doesn't work that way. But what's critical here is the fact that academic papers are somewhat positions as well. In as much as they have empirical data, they are also debated and they're also contested. And many of these influencers fail to present the debates. Rather, they basically choose a certain part of the academic literature to forward their own selective and nefarious positions. Next slide, please. The third one is what I call discrediting. Competing analysts are U.S. funded agents. Of course, you have like Commodore here, Jay on the left, being called what do they call this? Japan bred. I cannot read it. Saboteur inserted in the Philippine Coast Guard. It's a really funny article. I in fact laughed when I read it. Basically, the argument here is that anybody who criticizes China or anybody who forwards U.S. interests are U.S. funded agents. Similarly, in the caption on the right is when Sasa wrote this really long Facebook page about the report I published with ADRi, and basically asserted that I was basically funded by the United States. Next slide, please. Now, what's critical here is that many of these analysts actually misrepresent what the United States is and sort of like misrepresent the issues in the United States. There's an idea that the United States is sort of like this like hegemonic empire that controls everything, and the CIA is sort of like out to sort of like maneuver everything, and everything is like controlled by the CIA, and everything is controlled by, I don't know, the NED. In many ways, this actually misrepresents U.S. political economic history. As anybody who has lived in the United States, and I've been here almost 2 decades. I mean, the United States is basically, in as much as it was an empire once upon a time, it was also a patchwork. It's sort of like a patchwork state where some U.S. agencies have a lot of capacity, but they're really weak in others. For instance, the DoD and the State Department, have a lot of capacity. But if you basically go to the DMV or some sort of American institution, like let's say, I don't know, like border control, for instance, they don't really have a lot of capacity. So what these influencers do, in other words, is they misrepresent how the United States works by painting as if the United States is a unified empire similar to China. Despite the fact that the United States actually, in the 1980s, went through a process of neoliberalization that resulted in the state gutting its own capacity in favor of letting private sector actors continue and proliferate and sort of like expand their activities. In many ways, there is a lot of worry right now with the American elections in November that Donald Trump is going to win. And many of the worries that we have in the Philippines, for instance, regarding certain candidates influenced by China, are also refracted in the American people today. Many people here in the US think about how the GOP is funded by the Russians, and sort of like Donald Trump is a Russian agent. In some ways, I sort of believe that it's very believable, and the fact that many U.S. agencies can't really come to like stop and intervene, it's a testament to how weak the American, I wouldn't say weak though, but how limited the American state has become compared to other states simply because of neoliberalism. Next slide, please. The third one is what I call misconstruing, creating a straw person position. So, for instance, okay, this is I think this is one of the speakers, right? Gordon Knott Center in Stanford, if I'm not mistaken. But this other one, the one on the left is Anne Malindog Oy criticizing Philippine lawyer Jay Batumbakal, when Batumbakal basically said that the Philippines must study ending Chinese business, must study limiting Chinese businesses in the country. And Melindog Oy and sort of the entire, machinery of Chinese propagandists in the Philippines basically lambasted and shamed Jay Batumbakal for making that position. Next slide, please. However, Jay's point, and what the propagandists basically did was to, they created a straw person argument that the Philippines is not going to survive if we decide to cut our ties with China. It decenters the issues, etc. It creates a straw person argument, and more importantly, in the Batang example, it's actually an empirical question as to the degree to which we can constrain Chinese influence. Like I would say that in as much as most countries in the world do depend on China economically, the degree to which we are dependent or other countries are dependent is an empirical question. So, for instance, in the South China Sea issue in the Philippines between 2013 and 2016, we do have very bad relations with China. China imposed sanctions on the Philippines, tourism, and you have like banana like sort of like sanctions. Nonetheless, we were not really harmed by those sanctions simply because they comprise a very, very small portion of the economy. If the PRC really wanted to harm the Philippines, it would have stopped mineral exports coming from the Philippines going to China. Nonetheless, that did not happen simply because China also needed Philippine resources. China needed Philippine nickel. I've done fieldwork in Tawi-Tawi, in Zambales, in like Agusan del Sur, where we actually do send a lot of minerals to China. When I say we, I'm talking about Filipino businesses, Filipino datus, and Filipino like local governments, etc. So there is a bargaining power. There is a Philippine bargaining power to some degree, and that must be studied. And that was what Batong Bakal was arguing. Next slide, please. So therefore, it is a bigger debate and a bigger study. Chinese investments are in fact decentralized, and this is what I was basically making an argument that, in many ways, it's hard to homogenize China. We're looking at a bunch of heterogeneous actors. Chinese influence is not as like all-encompassing on their own firms even. And when we think about trade, it is often immune from disputes. So in many ways, there is a substantive academic question: to what degree can we actually constrain malign Chinese economic financing in the Philippines? We're not constraining all types of money, but we're only constraining some of them. And that is something that the influencers did not get into. Instead, they basically shame Batong Bakal by just talking about his point as if it's a ridiculous one. Next slide, please. Finally, I'm going to talk about shaming. Basically, personal attacks deter people from posting. So Mark Lopez here basically criticized Richard Haydarian, and he called Haydarian names. Similarly, Sasot talks about other sort of like, talks about, I think, like Justice Carpio and other people. And I think even Professor Manhit was also like subject to their sort of these criticisms by Sasot. So what this does is that it invites other posters from coming in and commenting, and sort of this joint collective act of shaming the competing idea, which is like which is like the idea that China is a nefarious actor. It's a type of propaganda and a type of repression because it shames individuals, it shames people. It's a form of verbal abuse that sort of like discourages people from participating in a democratic conversation. Next slide, please. So in a way, key points of shaming: personal attacks, and it invites trolls and participants to make fun of the competing figure. Next slide, please. Now, given this research is going to be published with StratBase, thank you, Professor Manhit, for accepting this paper, even though I was quite unsure whether or not it should be accepted because of the personal. I've talked about these people quite a bit, but I'm doing some future research right now where I've developed a program in Python. It's a programming tool where I basically scrape Facebook and I scrape Twitter for this data. I look at their propaganda, I scrape them, and I look at the different modes. One can sort of study the different changes over time of like the posting, and one can look at a social network analysis of the relationship of the social media personalities with other social media personalities in other countries, specifically ones that are forwarding pro-PRC interests. Next slide, please. Overall, I argue that the paper looks at 5 different modes of digital propaganda, and in a way, it's not really effective. Trust towards the PRC has decreased, as many of my co-panelists have actually argued in the previous presentations. Thank you very much, and apologies again for the mishap over Zoom.
Thank you, Dr. Alvin Kamba, for that discussion as well. And thank you to our speakers and their insights. At this point, I would like to invite all our speakers present, Commodore J. Toriela, Ms. Joyce Ilas Reyes, and Mr. Karel Galang to please come up on stage for our panel discussion. And we will be also joined by retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Raymond Powell, who is the founder and director of Project Sea Light for this panel. We will also continue to have with us on Zoom Dr. Benjamin Gorigolzari and Dr. Alvin Kamba as members. And we would like to ask you to please come up on stage. And before we start our panel as well, we would like to ask our speakers who will be coming up for a photo opportunity. We would like to ask also Professor Dindo Manhit to join us and our ambassadors. Ambassador Juha Paiko of the Embassy of Finland to the Philippines, Ambassador Peter Kelm, the Ambassador of New Zealand to the Philippines. We have also Ambassador Megawati Manan, the Ambassador of Brunei to the Philippines, and Mr. James Yeomans from the Embassy of Australia to the Philippines. So we will continue to be joined by our panel, who is also our speakers who are also online. So once again, thank you to our speakers who have provided a very interesting discussion, and I'm sure many of you might have questions as well that you would like to ask all our speakers regarding their research and their studies and even their own experiences. But first, I would like to start off this discussion by asking our panel members, and we can go one by one through this. So we've seen how assertive transparency, it's been discussed across the presentations as well. And I would like to ask, what trends do you foresee in the coming years in terms of assertive transparency, and at the same time, the malign influence that we see across the digital sphere and even across what we see in the West Philippine Sea? Maybe Colonel Ray can start.
Well, thank you. So I guess the thing I would like to start with is, first of all, thank you to StratBase for allowing Dr. Ben and I to publish our paper. I don't know that we drew attention to that, but StratBase did put it up on their website, Game Changer, talking about the Philippines' assertive transparency as a counter gray zone innovation. And I want to emphasize that from our perspective, this should be the start of a discussion about assertive transparency as a counter gray zone tactic, not the end of one. We're not saying that our presentation of this should be the view on the value of assertive transparency. What we hope to happen is that there will be a deep dive into this by academic institutions, say defense colleges, foreign service institutes, people across the spectrum analyzing what is the effectiveness of assertive transparency, what can we find historical examples? One of the challenges we found in putting the paper together was there weren't a lot of analogs. We couldn't find other instances in history where a country did something like what the Philippines is doing. And I also, in calling it assertive transparency, I want to emphasize the difference. Something that Dr. Ben drew out was this is more than just reactive or incidental transparency. It wasn't just that something bad happened to the Philippines and they decided to publish the pictures. What the Philippines did took that a step further, which was to actually send out the ships and the planes and the reporters to document incidents of coercion and harassment that maybe would not have been highlighted otherwise. And so by turning it into something very assertive, I think, and doing it in the face of a sophisticated gray zone actor, to us is something that deserves a lot of study and, really should be we should uncover what is the potential of assertive transparency, not only to counter Chinese coercion in the West Philippine Sea, but to counter gray zone actions across all domains, across a variety of different theaters. And so we're hoping that students, researchers, academics, military, and international security experts will dig into this, challenge us, tell us where we're wrong. We really want to see this become a topic of discussion, because we think that as a counter gray zone tactic, what the Philippines has done is so innovative and important.
Commodore J.
Thank you for a very difficult question. Now, but before I respond to your question, I would like to highlight the fact that the transparency initiative that we had, speaking on behalf of the government and as part of the National Task Force West Philippine Sea, there are two main objectives. That's why we had transparency initiative in the West Philippine Sea. Of course, the first one I mentioned is for the Filipino people to be aware of what's happening in the West Philippine Sea. I keep on mentioning that, for the past 6 years of the previous administration, there were very little information about what's happening in the West Philippine Sea. That's why it became, the main objective of this current administration, to make the Filipino aware of what's really happening. And then the second really was for the international community to be aware of the bullying behavior, the coercion, the illegal actions of the People's Republic of China in the West Philippine Sea. So that's the other reason. So if you're going to ask me how do we see it in the long term, I think in this current administration, which will only last until 2028, we're going to sustain this approach in our strategy in the West Philippine Sea. We believe that it has gained so much effect in our awareness for the Filipino people. The international community has been becoming more supportive in our efforts in the West Philippine Sea in condemning Chinese illegal actions. And then the second one, I think, besides from awareness of the Filipino people, even the civil society now is taking part of our actions in the West Philippine Sea. I think Atin Ito Coalition for the Christmas Convoy is a good example of how we can be able to rally support from civil society. Even academic are now into looking the relevance of the transparency in addressing Chinese gray zone. And then, of course, in the long-term goal that we really need to have in analyzing the effect of the transparency strategy is how effective it is every time we put a light on the Chinese gray zone activity. I think in the academic world, this is something that is really needs to be researched further to understand whether is there really a significant impact every time we expose the Chinese aggression. So this can be something that can be replicated by other countries in the region, whether for Vietnam, Malaysia, or even Indonesia with their issue of Natuna Island. This is something that would discourage China in carrying out gray zone actions. Thank you.
Mr. Carell.
Yeah, I'm not a security expert, but I guess I can provide some inputs on how civil society can sort of participate in this, in the enforcement of this assertive transparency. And it does not only apply on what happens in South China Sea, but also in arenas such as the digital space, where a lot of the propaganda is also happening and a lot of disinformation spread by these malign actors. And there are good practices in the region where we can learn from. For instance, in Taiwan, there is this one of the most prominent actors there is an organization called the Double Think Lab, which publishes this China Index every year. And in that index, essentially, they dissect and analyze what sort of propaganda and how different spaces in the democratic spaces are being influenced. And unfortunately, the Philippines ranks 7th as the most influenced, or as the most influenced country in terms of, or impacted country in terms of Chinese influences. So civil society on this regard can play a role in terms of simplifying information, making sure that they are easily digestible, making sure that they are well spread and well understood. So I guess some points from my side.
Yeah, thank you. How about, can we ask Dr. Alvin Kamba regarding trends that you foresee in the coming years?
Oh, well, hello, co-panelists. I do appreciate the assertive transparency concept. It sort of reminds me of like police disputes here in the US, when you sort of like bring a camera and sort of like it's a way for you to limit the abuses of a cop in the middle of nowhere. This police person might end up like abusing you. But like if you have a camera, if you have a video camera, and you mandate cops to sort of like take videos, that sort of limits the abuse, right? I mean, that's sort of the concept in some ways, in a different perspective. One thing about disinformation, though, I think for me, they really ride the coattails of a particular political faction in the Philippines, and we know this, the Duterte camp, Sara Duterte, and I sort of worry about if Sara Duterte wins the upcoming Philippine elections, to what extent can we actually sort of like follow up with assertive transparency, etc. I think that's the only thing.
Thank you. How about, can we ask Dr. Ben regarding this?
Yeah, I think more often than not, Ray will effectively communicate my positions, but just some of the things that I talked a little bit about. Assertive transparency, the effects of assertive transparency are really in their infancy here. And this does seem to be something where again, area under the curve matters. The more we can kind of aggregate effects, the better sense we'll get for just how useful this tool is. So the more we get other nations and organizations involved, does this have a nonlinear effect in the South China Sea? So just kind of stress testing this theory both in and outside of the Philippines is certainly the trend we hope to see on our end.
Thank you, Dr. Ben. And Joyce, you can tell us more about these trends as well.
What China is doing right now will not end anytime soon. So it's a marathon. It's a very, it will take a long time before this will end. I don't know if it will end in our lifetime. But whatever it is we're doing right now, it's effective. But of course, we expect China to be able to keep up soon, to develop their own counter actions to this assertive transparency that we are doing. So I'm not a national security expert as well. My area of expertise is more on governance. So I would propose, as I mentioned in my recommendations, we need to institutionalize some how we address the disinformation happening in the context of the West Philippine Sea. As I mentioned earlier, there is a need to continuously educate the public. We can include it in the curriculum. And we can also pass the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which would, as I think it was Alvin who mentioned earlier, it would provide transparency on why these influencers are saying the things that they are saying, and it would help the public understand better or make a more informed decision on when they process the information shared to them by these influencers.
Thank you. Just speaking about what you mentioned, Joyce, briefly, about institutionalizing all these, the assertive transparency that we are seeing across government. This is a question to Commodore J also. more specifically regarding the Philippine Coast Guard, how do you think these reforms can be institutionalized? Seeing that there's already a momentum going on, maybe you can tell us even a bit about the experience in the past, as you've mentioned, but maybe in more detail, and how these can be furthered, like what the Philippine Coast Guard is doing currently.
Well, first of all, I think our approach now in being more transparent with the Chinese aggression is a bit institutionalized in a way that everything that we release publicly, also for the decision whether we embed the media or not, is not a decision that is only being made by the Coast Guard alone. It has to pass through the information working group and of the National Task Force West Philippine Sea. The information working group is actually composed of members from the Department of National Defense, Armed Forces of the Philippines, Department of Foreign Affairs, Department of Justice, National Security Council, what else? Of course, the Philippine Coast Guard is there as well. And among ourselves, we discuss whether the information, that's why I would always say it's not so assertive, but it's strategic. I have to be very honest with everyone that not everything we experience in the West Philippine Sea is openly released to the public. There are measured, there is a strategic objective for every news that we inform the public about. Something that we should measure to make sure that it will not be a result of panic or misinterpretation of public. So we have institutionalized it in a way that those information are processed by the information working group. And among our agencies, based on our mandates, particularly, of course, the Department of Foreign Affairs and the DND and Armed Forces of the Philippines, they can also make recommendations. For example, for a press release that is being moved forward by the Coast Guard, they can also recommend whether it's to be released or not to be released. And then once it is processed by the information working group, it will be elevated to the National Task Force West Philippine Sea. And of course, it's subject to the approval of the National Security Advisor. So since we started this kind of approach, I think our transparency now is a bit institutionalized because we now have a procedure and it's not just a random thing that we tell the public about the Chinese aggression.
Thank you. That's very interesting to know that even probably beyond this, the politics that is happening that leads into these discussions, we see that there is a form and a procedure that is already being followed. So I'd like to ask Dr. Benjamin and Colonel Ray if you can answer this one. So what are the factors that would possibly influence these changes, as you've mentioned, whether it's for better or for worse, this assertive transparency and even the malign influence that China does? So what are possible factors that might influence exacerbating the happenings in the West Philippine Sea?
So let me talk about the threats to assertive transparency as a policy. And I want to go back to a discussion we had at the StratBase event in March of last year, and then a subsequent op-ed I put in the Rappler newspaper on the same topic about the importance of institutionalizing transparency. And one of the things that I mentioned in the context of that is it will be important to write down what the policy is. And the reason is because the policy is certainly going to come under great pressure from outside influences. It doesn't have to be coming from the Chinese embassy. It can come from business interests. It can come from nervous bureaucrats. It can come from all kinds of places, people who are worried. I mean, look, I spent 35 years in a bureaucracy. I know that there are pressures not to release. The natural state of any bureaucracy is to do the least risky thing. And so, it's just a fact of life. And so writing down what your policy is will really facilitate it sort of enduring over the long term. So for example, in 2003, when the United States went into Iraq, there was a written policy on embedding reporters. And they took the time to do that, in part based on lessons that they learned from previous conflicts, especially the first Gulf War, when all of the reporters were put into a pool and only certain ones were picked out to go look at this thing over here, and then they could report back to their friends. You can imagine how much the reporters hated that, right? So in leading into 2003, the US military made kind of a risky decision in a bureaucratic sense, and that was to embed them with the troops. And what they found out was not only was the reporting very good, it was also very sympathetic because the reporters came into contact with all of these very professional troops and wrote good stories about them, and we got those benefits. We got the national resilience. We got the international support. All of these things came with a policy that everybody could comprehend, and it begins with the fact that the United States and the Philippines are open societies. We value the freedom of the press. We want the press involved and trust them that they will tell good, honest, responsible stories, and what we find is that that's true. And by writing it down, then it takes a lot of the pressure off, because what you will find, so I'll say something here that may sound a little controversial. I have noticed that there have recently been 3 different deployments of Philippine vessels into the West Philippine Sea. We had, of course, the joint patrol with the United States. We had the BRP Teresa Magbanwa out at Scarborough Shoal, and we had the resupply mission that was relatively uneventful out to Ayungin Shoal. I think I would have noticed if had there been embedded reporters on any of those, and there were not. Nobody says there has to be embedded reporters on any given mission, but it was remarkable that, you know, sort of coming from December, where there were embedded reporters on every mission, that this time there were none. Again, the government, as Commodore Jay said, makes strategic decisions, and they're free to make any decision they would like to on embedding reporters. But I think it would help to sort of regularize it if there were written policies that says this is how we're going to do embedded reporting. And that way the country can see it and rationalize it and say, it's not just going to sort of swing all the way from 0, we're not going to have any, to 10, we're going to have them all the time, but there's a routine, right? So I think that, you know, putting those things down in writing, deciding what the policy is, how should journalists interact with the government to know when they can or cannot go on missions. And by the way, they don't all have to be highly controversial or contested missions. Sometimes you can go out with the Coast Guard when they're in the Sulu Sea just because it's an interesting story to see how they do their job in the Sulu Sea, right? So, you know, I think that it would be really helpful, and again, I said this back in March of last year, and I will reiterate it now, to actually put it down and disseminate it so everybody understands it.
All right. So we have a question from the audience as well, and this is directed to Colonel Ray as well, and maybe someone from can also answer this from our audience. So last year, Canada expressed willingness to assist the Philippines' maritime domain awareness through a dark vessel detection system. So how can dark vessels be beneficial to assertive transparency efforts, especially in the context of the West Philippine Sea? So as Canada's been mentioned, maybe Colonel Ray, you can give us a few thoughts as well on this, and maybe members from the Canadian Embassy can also speak.
Actually, my first question is, did that question come from the Canadian Embassy? So you know, first of all, and you know, Dr. Ben mentioned this in his remarks. The dark vessel detection system that Canada has provided is one example of how the international support comes in as a result of you know, assertive transparency. Canada had to make a decision as to whether and to whom it would give this very this great capability. As we know, a lot of the vessels that we are concerned about conducting coercive or harassing activities are ones that, quote, go dark. We see it every single time there is an Ayungin Shoal resupply. We see that at Scarborough Shoal. When a vessel goes dark, the first question I have is, what are you doing, right? What are you up to? And so when we put together on the Sea Light website, we put together the Gray Zone Tactics Playbook. One of our articles was all about the gray zone tactic of going dark. So dark vessel detection is something that is crucial for being able to see what the adversary is doing that they don't want you to see. And when a ship goes dark, it's almost always not for a great reason, right? So one of the things I think I would stress would be that when you have a capability like the Canadian Embassy has provided with dark vessel detection, make that as broadly available as possible within the Philippine government, right? Or even outside, wherever the Canadians will let you, right? Make that available, because maximum transparency brings maximum accountability, and it can diffuse the pressure on any one agency or another, to say, well, we can't tell anybody about this because somebody might get mad, right? Again, if you turn on the lights in the gray zone, all of a sudden the cockroaches scatter. And so the more light, the better. And so if there are agencies in the Philippine government that have dark vessel detection and others that maybe need it but do not, let's make that as broadly available as possible.
Maybe someone from the Canadian Embassy can speak on this as well.
Sure, I wonder who's going to do that. Thank you, mysterious questioner, for putting me on the spot. I'm happy to talk about dark vessel detection all day, but I think I'd rather stay in the line of the main subject that we have, and I'll use DVD as the hook. In 2022, my country released its Indo-Pacific strategy, and that was itself an exercise in assertive transparency. I invite anyone here to go online and read the China chapter for a very clear-eyed view of what we understand the challenges to be in this part of the world. And that guided the approach that has informed our engagement here in the Philippines. That came with not only a commitment to deliver dark vessel detection to help address transparency at sea and in the maritime domain, but as our colleagues from StratBase and many else here in the room know, it also came with commitments in the area of countering malign influence, cyber defense, and cybersecurity, because we believe that assertive transparency must be in all domains simultaneously. I invite any of you to go Google what's happening in Canada right now. We are having a very public inquiry into foreign interference by one particular adversary, in this case, that is in the public domain at home. So we have long experience with this, and that is very much informed why we did what we did in the approach that we took here in the Philippines. Picking up on what Ray said, I think a key lesson that we've learned over time is exactly that you need to go broad and wide, which is why we have provided this capability to 16 departments and agencies of the Philippine government who are using it every single day. We see the usage rates. We had to increase the server power. It outstripped expectations. And I can share with this audience that we are working right now to deploy phase 2 and phase 3, which will see it extended out to the Visayas and to Mindanao to cover other areas. So it's just a question of training operators. But we certainly see this as a way in which our country of relatively modest means can contribute to the success that the Philippines has been pioneering and lend some of our experience to that effort. And we'll be happy to continue to do so. Thanks.
Thank you for this. So thank you for answering that question. Now we move on to something, of course, another contested area, which is the digital space, the misinformation that happens there. And I think I'd like to pose this question to Joyce and to Dr. Alvin as well. And maybe Mr. Carell can also give us his opinion regarding this. So do you think that these statements of support coming from the administration and all the efforts of the government right now on assertive transparency are dissuading genuine misinformed supporters of the People's Republic of China, of the PRC? Or are these influencers and the misinformation online still gaining momentum in a way? Maybe Joyce, you can start off this question.
The question if it's dissuading supporters of China here in the Philippines. Because I don't think it would be able to, whatever it is we're doing, it won't be able to dissuade those outside the Philippines, because whatever it is we're doing here, it's not reaching them. Yes, I would like to think so. The assertive transparency, the transparency initiative that the government is doing is very helpful in in raising awareness amongst the Filipino public. And I would like to also point out that it is also very important that the political leaders, who many of the Filipinos listen to, are echoing the same or are saying the same thing, because it was very evident during the time of the Duterte, during the time of the former president, Rodrigo Duterte, that when he is saying things supporting China's initiatives, the public perception is really that, or at least some Filipinos think that China is very helpful to us, that China is a friend. But right now, the multipolar stand of the new administration, I think, is very helpful in raising awareness amongst Filipinos, and that we are not alone in this, that there are other allies that we can also tap in this, in our efforts in asserting our rights in the West Philippine Sea.
So, Dr. Alvin, maybe you can tell us if these influencers are gaining momentum, or are they being stopped by the current administration's efforts?
Sure. So to answer your question first, and then I have a very pessimistic sort of like answer over all the sort of like influencers. So I'm creating a data set on sort of like many of the social media posting, whether they're from the influencers or they're from some random social media accounts. And I think since 2023 of February, many of these like narratives have actually gone up by maybe around 600 to 800%, depending on sort of like which timeline, with that, which time frame you're looking at. So in some ways, they actually did not stop. They've actually intensified it, and it's quite logical. The United Front invested in a couple of people, and therefore they've put their money in the hands of these people, and they're going to do a lot of things to make sure that they do their jobs, and that includes talking about the South China Sea issue in a very particular way that's misconstrued and that's wrong and that's not empirically grounded. So it hasn't really stopped them. But my perspective when it comes to these influencers is that I actually think they're very effective, but maybe they're not effective in terms of like, I don't think they're effective in forwarding sort of, let's say, particular forms of Chinese interest, but I think the influencers are very effective. And I think the reason why they're not, and there's a reason for that. Voters in the Philippines are multi-issue voters. They don't just vote on one issue. They can basically like Duterte and they can basically dislike China. And therefore, as we've seen in the recent elections, there was a massive wave of like support for Sara Duterte and of course the current administration. And that sort of like, people from that camp expected the current administration to sort of follow what Rodrigo Duterte did. That never happened. And a huge part of the success of Sara Duterte and even Bongbong Marcos actually goes back to many of these influencers, and that attests to their effectiveness overall. Now, the influencers are relatively ineffective when it comes to the South China Sea issue, and I don't think it's because of like, I don't think that's because influencers are like they're not good at it. I think it's because the South China Sea issue is an emotional nationalist issue when it comes to many Filipinos. Filipinos are even during the era of censorship during Duterte, relative censorship when it comes to the South China Sea. Filipinos are bombarded of news about Filipino fishers getting rammed and getting abused by Chinese fishing ships and Chinese Coast Guard in the South China Sea. In 2018, there was a rise of Chinese online gambling in the Philippines, and even right now, you still have this online gambling and scam compounds. That resulted in 500,000 to 1 million Chinese illegal and legal migrants in the Philippines, or Chinese PRC citizens living with Filipinos in Metro Manila, in Cebu, in Davao City. So in many ways, the everyday experiences of Filipinos were actually affected by what they see in the news, but at the same time, but what they encounter, let's say, every day with other Chinese people. So with PRC people from China. So Chinese people from the PRC, God, I mix it up all the time. But the broader point is that I think the influencers are effective, but they're not effective in the China issue. And I think we need to worry about if they forward a particular candidate and whether this candidate will actually forward a particular form of interest once she comes into power. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so we have questions from the media. First, we would like to. I have here GMA7. You would like to ask a question?
Hi.
Yes.
Morning, I'm Chino from GMA7. I have two questions, if you can allow me. Sorry. I listed it down para hindi ko makalimutan, so I won't forget. Um, right. Someone mentioned, I think Jay mentioned that the transparency initiative should be safeguarded by the Filipinos, and I guess the other panelists would share that views as well. And that there's the danger of it being used merely for political leverage. Is there a trend that we see why we would think that way? And if so, what's the danger moving forward?
Definitely, I know that Chino knows the answer to this question. He just wants to hear it from us.
Yes, of course.
Well, the reason why I mentioned that the nation should safeguard our transparency towards the West Philippine Sea because even without mentioning anybody, we can see it from how some politicians are using the West Philippine Sea as a mere political slogan for them to gain public support or to make the public believe that they are really in line with the interests of the Filipino people. And again, Chino, I don't want to be very specific as to whether I'm saying a particular politician or not, but definitely this is a trend that we can see because of the upcoming midterm election. Many politicians before in the previous administration had become very silent about the West Philippine Sea. There are only very few that you can say that they are really sincere with how they support the West Philippine Sea now. So I would like to end it that way, Chino. Thank you.
Follow-up question. Not for you, sir. Okay na. Put you on the spot. Someone also mentioned that part of the Chinese disinformation involves engaging with our academe, our public officials, and perhaps peddling influence or worse. How bad is it at this point in time, based on your understanding and your perception? How bad is it, the influence in terms of our public officers, in terms of our academe, in terms of media? For example, the recent incident in Bajo de Masinloc where China claims that they actually drove away a Philippine Coast Guard vessel is being passed off by some groups here as the real narrative. So again, how bad is Chinese influence at this point?
About the political Filipino politicians, the thing with Filipino politicians is that some of their ideologies are also very seasonal. It depends on what the public feels right now. If the public says that they are concerned about the West Philippine Sea, of course they would say things that are favorable to and protect the West Philippine Sea. It also depends on who is the president, on who is in power. If the person in power who can provide them with whatever it is that they need for their constituency says that we should protect the West Philippine Sea, of course they will echo that sentiment. That is what we saw in from 2016 to 2022 with many politicians echoing what Duterte was saying. I asked this when I interviewed with Asek Malaya of the NSC. I asked him if they have intel on if China still has strong influence over our politicians, over our local, or even has influence over our national and local leaders. And he said that I'm not sure if I should speak on his behalf. But then he said that because of the pronouncements of our current leader, many of them who used to be very vocal about China are not as vocal about China today because of, again, their seasonal beliefs.
Thank you. So we have another one from the media as well. We have Eric Lachica. Yes. Please tell us who you're directing the question to. Thank you.
Eric Lachica from the U.S. Filipinos for Good Governance. We're an advocacy group in Washington, D.C. I just arrived 2 weeks ago, and the very good theme, assertive transparency. And I just wanted to raise, because many of these worries that we read in the newspapers, internet, For example, last month, the chair of the Philippine Senate on Foreign Relations, the eldest sister of the president, raised her complaint of the inexplicable silence about the 39 million gallons of fuel from the Indo-Pacific Command I found out yesterday, it was already delivered in Subic. So why that seems to be a frequent complaint of the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee that should be part of your supporting coalition. Why is there a lack of transparency? Especially the terms of engagement under EDCA. She has asked for that. By the way, I support the EDCA, the bilateral partnership, just to be very clear. But why it's been raised since last June? We haven't seen the terms of engagement. In fact, if you recall, the chair raised the question, will the Philippines pay for the electricity and the water for the EDCA bases? Those things are very basic if you want to win popular support for the EDCA basis. I just want to pose that question. Has there been any official guidelines, as Captain Schust, on this dealing with a proactive, assertive transparency that would really improve the bilateral partnership? That's my question.
I'm sorry, I have no contact or official relationship with U.S. Indo-Pacific Command or the U.S. government, so I can't speak on behalf of the U.S. government. So I certainly encourage transparency in all facets of government. I'm afraid, I'm sorry, I'm just not tracking that issue very closely.
So, all right, so we have, yes, we have also Miss Ellen Tordesillas, who has a question as well.
Good morning. Yeah, I'm Ellen Tordesillas of Vera Files. It's a non-profit media organization in the Philippines. Yeah, last month at the 8th bilateral consultation mechanism of the South China Sea in Shanghai, Philippine Undersecretary Tess Lazaro and Chinese Assistant Foreign Minister Nong Rong agreed to de-escalate the situation in the South China Sea, and both sides agreed to calmly deal with incidents, if any, through diplomacy. I'd like to ask Commodore Tariela, how this did affect your style of assertive transparency? And are you, well, they call it cooling off. While we are in the cooling off stage, what efforts are being done to preserve the gains of what have been enumerated as the gains of of your policy of assertive transparency?
Thank you, Ma'am Ellen, for your question. I would like to respond with your reference with the last recently concluded January 17 BCM as to the de-escalation part, which was agreed upon by the United States and the People's Republic of China and the Philippines. This was also re-echoed by the Chinese ambassador saying that we should de-escalate and talk about the tension in the West Philippine Sea. But if you're asking me now, if we have already came up with a mechanism or a detailed guidance to the NTF-WPS or to the Philippine Coast Guard in particular in, I don't know, toning down a bit our transparency, that has never happened yet. We haven't received anything yet that would, say that we are de-escalating because of the agreed terms of the January 17 meeting. Second, I always respond with this kind of question with the media personalities every time they ask me about the statement of the Chinese ambassador that we should de-escalate. I always responded by saying, in the part of the Philippine government, there's no reason for us to de-escalate. It is them who is escalating the tension, and it's just us who is on the receiving end. So I don't agree with the term, both countries will de-escalate, because we're not escalating the tension. We're just exercising our sovereign rights. And that is something that is not provocative or escalatory on the part of the Philippine government.
Of course, it should be noted that the agreement followed the statement of the ASEAN ministers last December expressing concern over the tensions in the South China Sea. Do you consider it a setback?
Setback on what terms, ma'am?
Yeah, on your program of assertive transparency, this agreement by the DFA with the Chinese Foreign Ministry of as stated in the statement to de-escalate and to deal with it calmly through diplomacy. Do you consider it a setback?
Let me again emphasize that our transparency initiative remains to be the same. How aggressive we are, how assertive we started until now, it remains to be the same. Our guidance from the National Security Advisor and the NTF-WPS remains to be the same. Nothing changed. We still choose to publicize the aggressive actions of China, just like what we did last weekend. When the Chinese Coast Guard did a dangerous maneuver, provocative behavior, crossing the bow of the Philippine Coast Guard, those videos and photos were still released. So as far as the national government is concerned about transparency, there's no setback here. We're still maintaining our strategy.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions coming from the audience. So we have Miss Allison Jackson.
Hi, I'm from Agence France Presse, AFP News Agency. I have a question for Commodore Tariella. Just following on from the pro-China misinformation and disinformation that we are seeing online. AFP's digital investigation journalists have also noticed a trend of pro-Philippine disinformation and misinformation online, that it's quite nationalistic. It's seeking to portray the Philippines as taking action against the Chinese at sea, such as a Philippine warship shooting down a Chinese drone. And we've debunked this misinformation and disinformation, but it is a trend that we're seeing increasingly. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that trend and how that might impact the Philippine government's transparency initiative, and whether it sort of undermines the messaging. I just had a follow-up question after that.
This is the reason why I only attend Strat-based only once a year, because most of the audience would always ask questions. No, just kidding. My think about this kind of bloggers trying to aggravate the response of the Philippine government towards the Chinese Coast Guard is that on the part of our national government, we don't support such kind of and I don't think that's something like we can say pro-China, pro-Philippines initiative of the trolls. We don't support that because our transparency initiative, I've always been mentioning this, is basically holds on to the foundation of telling factual narrative based on the truth. There's no reason for us to distort the narrative of what really transpired. So if you're going to ask me whether it undermines our transparency initiative, I think so. Because as I said, the main objective of the transparency initiative is to tell factual narratives, to create awareness to the Filipino people of what's really happening. And those kind of lies or exaggerated narratives doesn't follow such objective of the Philippine government.
I just had a follow-up question, if you don't mind. So on that note, I guess, then if the transparency initiative or if the messaging about what's happening in the South China Sea is not resonating with regular Filipinos, and so in our reporting, I was speaking to some experts on this issue, suggests that discussing the talk about the Chinese bullying and their aggressiveness is not actually connecting with regular Filipinos who are more concerned about, who have greater issues to be worried about, and such as their livelihoods. I'm just wondering if that message isn't sinking in, what else can the government do in order to make people engaged and for it to resonate?
Well, Alison, I think, let me first respond to this, Professor Dino. I think the result of the survey that was recently concluded last month would speak that the Filipino people, the messaging of our transparency has already resonated for their approval of the effort of the national government. And I would just, put it that way.
I'd like to respond to that. I don't know what's the basis of it not resonating, because we have done surveys since 2016, twice a year, and it's not gone beyond 80% of Filipinos across sector, from A, B, C, D, E, Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao. That is the narrative of what Joyce mentioned earlier, that they'd like to focus on urgent national concern. And if you follow that question, what is your concern? Generally, I'm poor, I'm hungry, I don't have a job. Then criminality, corruption of government officials. Then comes West Philippine Sea. But when you ask specifically, where do you stand on West Philippine Sea? And I will not go back to 2016, which hit 84%, while Duterte was saying it's a piece of paper. June 2022, the Filipinos said 90% of them would like, and I can show that, it's in the website of Pulse Asia, that Filipinos would like the president to assert their rights. And I believe our own president listened to the people, because that's what national interest is. Then just last December, we saw those numbers again, that even we need to modernize. That means specific actions. So it's resonating. If you travel to West Philippine Sea area, especially for Filipinos like me, I helped start the term West Philippine Sea. It did not exist in 2011. You go to fisher folks, they use those terms. And for me, that's resonating. So I hope let's not be carried by the narrative of Chinese disinformation. That's why we're having this. As a private institutions, we have kept this issue alive because we believe as we travel, this is what the Filipino people want. I just want to clarify that. It's resonating. That's why you see, in the words of Joyce, politicians close to President Duterte saying, West Philippine Sea, atin ito. Do you want to understand why? It's election season next year. And no national candidate will win if you're not with the Filipino people. I just want to clarify that. I did not like to speak, but that kind of disinformation should not even be discussed in a place like this where we spend so much effort and time to fight disinformation.
So we have one question as well for Mr. Karel Galang. And we can see that the significance of these tactics, right, extend beyond the Philippines. And as you've mentioned, this goes across the Asian, the Pacific, such as Fiji, Thailand, and Indonesia. One question that we have is, what are the implications of the usage of these tactics by the Chinese Communist Party to our country in the Philippines? How does this affect us, and what can we do to stop these effects happening to us?
I mean, I discussed earlier that there are pervasive impacts to our democratic institutions. The mere fact that they are using propaganda to distort, public perception of, our positions, how we perceive information is a direct attack on our, freedom of information. Not only that, I mean, the mere fact that they are connecting with parties, with specific people, specific businesses, just to push their agenda sort of also is an action that undermines, our democratic processes and democratic, institutions. So it attacks our way of life, essentially, as a democratic country.
All right, thank you. I know that many of you might have more questions as well. Please feel free to speak to them after our session. But ladies and gentlemen, please give our speakers a round of applause. Thank you very much. So right now, to give us today's closing acknowledgements, we would like to call on Mr. James Yeomans, Counselor of Political, Economic, and Public Affairs from the Embassy of Australia in the Philippines. Please give him a round of applause.
Thanks, Alina, and thanks, of course, to Dindo, Joyce, and all the team from Stratbase ADR. I mean, for really hosting and putting together what has been a wonderful event. And of course, thank you to all our speakers, both here and online. I think all of us in the room will really acknowledge that there's enormous value from what we've heard today, really to understand the importance of transparency, and not just here in the Philippines, but of course, internationally in the global community has a real interest in what's happening here too, and transparency is fundamental to that. But also these events, they really show that it's not just about people discussing things. I mean, what we hear today builds our understanding, it helps influence policy development, and it really plays a critical role on what is a very valuable and very, very important topic that we're all engaged in. So just quickly, I know everybody's hungry and I don't want to keep everybody, but of course last year when the Australian Prime Minister was here with President Marcos and they signed our strategic partnership, one of the things that both leaders said in the context of Indo-Pacific security and maintaining peace and stability, as they said, we will work in partnership to build strategic capability and demonstrate our shared commitment to maintaining an environment that guards against conflict. And this event today, with Australia's support, is precisely an example of how we do that. We have a lot of engagement across the maritime sphere in many different areas, including the environment, security, capability, but supporting Stratbase and supporting these really valuable discussions is another way we do that. And of course, we're very proud to have been doing that now, I think, for 10 different events, and we'll continue to do so. So once again, I'd just like to formally thank everyone who's here, especially our friends in the media, for all of you for being here today, and we look forward to many more events. Maraming salamat and mabuhay.
Thank you, Mr. Yeomans. That concludes today's hybrid town hall discussion entitled Unveiling Asymmetric Challenges Through Assertive Transparency. Thank you to those who have joined us here in person and online as well. This has been your host, Shanice Espiritu Amador, wishing you a pleasant day ahead. Thank you, everyone. We have snacks for everyone as well on this side, so please feel free to have some. And also speaker tables will be receiving plated food. Thank you.